Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. I know it's morning for some of you, so welcome. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Thank you and welcome to our guest, Steve Zipperstein, who will update us on the Israel-Gaza war and focus on an issue we don't often hear much about, which is the primary topic of tonight's program, the legal aspects of the war in Gaza. Thank you to our moderator extraordinaire, Madeleine Brand. We really appreciate both of you being with us. Next Wednesday, we will welcome the former executive director, I think the president actually, of the Council of Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, to discuss defining success in Ukraine and Gaza. It should be a very interesting program from a very informed speaker. Then the following week, we just added a program, our 15th Israel in Crisis program, featuring Aaron David Miller, who spent 25 years at the State Department focusing on the Middle East and is now a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And he's a global affairs analyst with CNN. That's on Monday, July 22nd. You can register tonight after our program. And then that same week on July 24th, we'll welcome Congressman Adam Schiff, who will give us his perspective from the Hill during these very tumultuous times. All of our upcoming programs are amazing and the speakers are the best. As we get closer to the election, we are planning a wide array of speakers to discuss more specific election-related topics. Stay tuned for more information and always look to the bottom of each email to sign up for new programs, which we add, sometimes out of order. So you have to sort of read through that list. Like we just added July 22 and we already had August programs advertised there. So read carefully. Jews United and America at a Crossroads is a nonprofit enterprise, but we don't ourselves do any activism, voting rights or voter protection projects. We don't organize and we don't run programs. However, under the activism tab on our website, we have all kinds of organizations, nonpartisan organizations, which we have vetted, which have lots of volunteer opportunities as the elections approach. You may be interested in getting involved with some of those organizations. Go to our website, find an organization. I think we have 25 or so that we vetted and that we present to you. And if you are involved with one that you want us to add, we'll be happy to vet it and post it. They have to be nonpartisan. We are a nonprofit organization. All of our programs are available via podcast and via our YouTube channel and our website, and a link to all of our past programs. We have 215 past programs archived in all those places. You can go and there's a search function. You can search the program or the speaker you'd like to see or hear and listen at your leisure. Now about tonight's speaker. Steve Zipperstein is a distinguished senior scholar and associate director at the UCLA Center for Middle East Development. He teaches in the public policy and global studies departments at UCLA. He also teaches at Tel Aviv University in Israel, the law school, and at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. Steve practiced law for more than 40 years, having served as the Chief Assistant United States Attorney in Los Angeles. He served as counselor to former U.S. Attorney Janet Reno and former Assistant Attorney General Robert Mueller, a name known well to all of us tonight. He was also a chief legal officer at Verizon Wireless and at BlackBerry Limited. Got a very broad array of very relevant experience. He's the author of several scholarly books about the legal history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. His newest book, The Legal Case for Palestine, A Critical Assessment, will be published, I think, this month, or maybe it already was. He'll be sure to let us know. So thank you very much, Steve Zipperstein, for being with us tonight. And Madeleine Brand, most of you who've been on our programs before know Madeleine well. She is the host of the award-winning daily news and culture show, Press Play, which airs on NPR's LA affiliate, KCRW. She has hosted and reported for NPR and for affiliate stations for more than 30 years, even though she doesn't look it. She has a master's degree from the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, where she also taught documentary radio. Madeleine, the program is all yours, and thank you both for being with us.
Janet, thank you. Thank you for having me back. Steve, welcome to the program. It's great.
Thank you so much.
I'm excited to get into it and really get into it, into the nitty-gritty. So why don't we just begin by starting with a little primer, a little history primer. Let's begin and not go all the way back thousands of years, but perhaps just back to 1967, when Israel took the West Bank and Gaza. Why would it want to hang on to those lands? What was Israel's interest in occupying the West Bank and Gaza, where, after all, a hostile population lived?
Well, first of all, great to be with you, and thank you, Janice, for the kind introduction. Look, between 1948, when Israel declared its independence, and 1967, Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip. Jordan occupied the West Bank. In fact, King Abdullah I purported to annex the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And in May of 1967, President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt began making extraordinarily threatening statements in public rallies in Cairo and on Cairo radio against Israel, united the Egyptian and Syrian militaries under a single command, and threatened to destroy Israel repeatedly. And then in late May of 1967, Nasser kicked out the United Nations Emergency Force from the Sinai Desert that had been there for the last 11 years, separating the Egyptian and Israeli militaries. And so the Israeli government realized that it was about to be attacked. The state of Israel was about to be attacked by Egypt and Syria. So the Israelis struck first, and very famously bombed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground in Egypt very successfully. King Hussein in Jordan, watching all of this, and the Israelis had begged him repeatedly, please stay out of the conflict. King Hussein attacked Israel anyway. King Hussein attacked first. And Israel then, in response to the Jordanian attack, exercised its right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter, defended itself, and 6 days later, Israel ended up in possession of the West Bank and East Jerusalem in the Old City, ended up in possession of the Golan Heights in the north and Gaza in the southwest. And so that's how Israel came into possession of those territories. And as far as the West Bank and Gaza are concerned, basically took over or stepped into the shoes of Jordan and Egypt as the occupants. Ever since, Israel's Supreme Court has said that even though the question of who owns the West Bank and who owns Gaza is completely up in the air, nobody has clear title, the Israeli Supreme Court has said, we will act as if we are a so-called belligerent occupant, a legal occupant maintaining the status quo under the so-called Hague regulations of 1907. And I'll say one more thing, Madeleine, in terms of just the quick reprise of the history. Fast forward to 1993, the Israelis and the PLO on the White House lawn shake hands, Arafat and Rabin, after signing the Oslo Accords. And the Oslo Accords were the result of months and months of intensive arm's-length, robust negotiations between Arafat and his right-hand guy at the time, now the head of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, and the Israelis. And among other things, the Oslo Accords, the Declaration of Principles in 1993, and then the interim agreement, the more detailed agreement in September of 1995, taken together, the Oslo Accords say that the West Bank will be divided into three areas, A, B, and C. A, the big towns, B, the medium towns under Palestinian civil control. Area C, where the Israeli settlements are, to remain under Israeli control until such time as a permanent peace deal could be struck. And the Oslo Accords say in clear language that until there's a permanent deal, the settlements can stay put, the settlers can stay put, Israel can continue to be in military control of the West Bank and in total control of that Area C. And so I don't think it's correct to assume that Israel wants to keep the West Bank and Gaza, although, of course, we have settlers and we have some very, very aggressive and radical settlers who want to annex the West Bank. We can talk about that if you want, but the official Israeli policy is title is unclear, ownership is unclear. We're here as a caretaker until there's a permanent peace deal.
Right, got it. But let me just ask you, like, back then, they win in 1967. Why didn't they say, okay, it's all yours. We're not going to hang on to it. Egypt, you can have Gaza back. Jordan, you can have West Bank back. That's it.
And actually, if you remember, the Security Council of the United Nations in November, just a few months later, November 1967, passed a resolution, Resolution 242, which called upon Israel to withdraw from territories. It doesn't say all the territories, just from territories occupied in the recent conflict, meaning the June 1967 war. And it calls upon the surrounding Arab countries, all of them, to recognize Israel's right to live within secure borders in peace. It doesn't say which has to occur first, land for peace or peace for land. That's ambiguous in the way it's drafted. But Israel, ever since then, has accepted Resolution 242 as the governing legal pronouncement from the UN Security Council regarding the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And so the official Israeli position again would be, make peace with us, normalize with us, as Jordan and Egypt and now the Abraham Accord countries have done, and we'll withdraw. And maybe we'll have a discussion about little land swaps here and there and the settlements, Ma'ale Adumim, that ring Jerusalem. But the governing principle is land for peace and peace for land.
Well, they have peace with Egypt and with
Yep.
Jordan.
Yep.
And so?
And not with Lebanon, not with Syria, not yet, hopefully soon with Saudi Arabia, not with Iraq. And so 242 applies to all those surrounding countries,
Right.
not just Egypt and Jordan.
And I guess Egypt and Jordan don't want those territories now.
Well, King Hussein renounced Jordan's claims to the West Bank in July of 1988, although the Jordanian government still claims its right to be the caretaker of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. And ever since 1967, there's been a so-called status quo arrangement between the Jordanian and Israeli governments whereby the Jordanians do have administrative control over the Muslim holy sites in East Jerusalem. Egypt and Jordan have both maintained the peace treaties. The treaties are a little bit shaky right now in the wake of the Gaza war. Hopefully, the Egyptians and Jordanians will not rescind or revoke the peace treaties. And hopefully, when the war ends or as part of the end of the war, we'll see normalization with Saudi Arabia, which would be a game changer.
Yeah. And what some have said may have provoked or been one of the reasons for the Hamas attack in October.
Well, certainly Hamas wanted to derail the
Yeah.
Biden administration's negotiations and the great progress the Biden administration had made a year ago now, last summer, toward sort of an overall package deal whereby the United States would enter into some kind of a defense pact with Saudi Arabia, in exchange for which the Israelis and the Saudis would do something for each other. Israel would recognize Palestinian statehood in the West Bank, and the Saudis would recognize Israel's existence and exchange ambassadors and diplomatic relations. Hamas did not want that to happen. The Iranians did not want that to happen. And you're exactly right. That was a part of the motivation for the Hamas attacks last October the 7th.
Okay, so let's get into Oslo, because I think Oslo is one of the biggest governing principles here when you're talking about what legal status Israel has over the West Bank and Gaza.
That's right.
And especially when you're talking about areas A, B, and C in the West Bank, which I guess can get kind of bureaucratic, but we can get into that. But overall, I guess it was the fatal flaw in these Oslo agreements was the fatal flaw, no concrete promise or end date for two states, for a Palestinian state.
Absolutely right. You're 100% right. I've spoken actually to several of the negotiators through work I do at UCLA in the region, very intensive work through the Center for Middle East Development. I'm in contact with many high-level policymakers in the region, and the Israeli moderate camp, in other words, Israelis who want to see the two-state solution, and the Palestinian moderate camp who want to see the two-state solution, are both incredibly frustrated that the issue of Palestinian statehood was not addressed in the Oslo Accords. You can scour the Oslo Accords and you will find no language whatsoever indicating that the outcome, the end result, should be the two-state solution. Instead, there are a list of 7 issues that were reserved for the later permanent status negotiations: borders, refugees, settlements, security, etc. And everyone tells me today, if we had only agreed back in 1993 and 1995 that the goal we were driving toward was the two-state solution, we would be in a very, very different posture than we are today.
And why didn't that happen?
Well, there are a number of theories. Based on my research, the Palestinians, Arafat and Abu Mazen, were primarily interested in securing recognition of the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and they did obtain that in the Oslo Accords in an exchange of letters between Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, letters that were sent to President Clinton separately. And the Israelis, for their part, have to keep in mind that the PLO was the author of many horrific terrorist attacks in Israel over the years, airplane hijackings, the school in Ma'alot, Kiryat Shmona, et cetera. And so for the
Munich Olympics.
yeah, we remember, I mean, those of us in Los Angeles will remember back in the early 1990s when the late Stanley Scheinbaum met with Arafat, Jesse Jackson met with Arafat. It was a huge controversy, if we remember. So for the Israelis to take the leap of faith, to recognize the PLO and to sign a series of agreements with the PLO back then was considered to be a very, very big deal. Rabin lost his life because he signed the Oslo Accords. Netanyahu stirring it up with the right wing in Israel. And we all remember how shocked we were when Yigal Amir, a young ultra-right Israeli, assassinated the prime minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin. And Rabin lost his life because of the Oslo Accords.
But couldn't the United States have insisted more forcefully that there be a two-state solution in the Oslo Accords and a guarantee of a Palestinian state? Janice mentioned Aaron David Miller will be on the program in a few weeks. He has accused the United States of basically being, and he was involved in those talks, of being Israel's lawyer and basically, presenting to the Palestinians Israel's case and not really doing it the other way around. So could it, how much blame can be placed at the feet of the U.S. negotiators for not insisting that be in the Accords?
Well, Aaron is a brilliant person with an incredibly distinguished career in diplomacy. I know him, and he's just wonderful. I would push back a little bit, though. The Oslo Accords resulted from direct negotiations brokered in Norway, by the Foreign Ministry in Norway, between the Israeli team and the Palestinians. Originally, there was a go-between, a lawyer that started things, and then the Palestinians and Israelis came together. And the reason they did that was to bypass the United States after then Secretary of State Warren Christopher, also great lawyer from Los Angeles, wonderful, amazing lawyer. Warren Christopher tried very hard to broker a deal between Hafiz al-Assad and the Israelis for a deal between Israel and Syria. When that didn't happen, the Israelis turned and pivoted to the Palestinians without American involvement initially. At the end, of course, the American government was very, very active. I don't think it's fair to say the Americans were acting as the lawyers for the Israelis. Both sides came together. And remember, this was after the Gulf War, after the 1991 conference in Madrid. Then Secretary of State James Baker in Bush 41 famously saying, in frustration with the then Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, when you're ready to make peace, here's the phone number of the State Department, call me. We all remember that. And so I don't think the Americans were doing the Israelis bidding. And also in 1993, Madeleine, people remembered very well that the UN General Assembly offered the two-state solution in November 1947, November 29th, 1947, the original UN two-state solution, the partition plan, which passed by the required two-thirds majority in the General Assembly. The Israelis, or they weren't Israelis yet, the Jews living in Tel Aviv, danced in the streets, and the Palestinian leader at the time, the Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, started a civil war on November 30th, 1947, the next day. And that war raged on until the Israelis declared independence in May of 48. And the next morning, Egypt bombed Tel Aviv, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, all invaded to try to destroy the new state, and unsuccessfully, ending in armistice agreements brokered by another Los Angeles person, Ralph Bunche, in April of 1949. So Americans remembered that during the time of the Oslo Accords and remembered that simply imposing a two-state solution or offering it at that time, as the UN tried to do, wouldn't work. The idea was, let's start kind of with a groundbreaking deal, the Oslo Accords. Let's then negotiate. The original plan was to have a permanent deal done by the end of the decade. That was President Clinton's goal. And when it didn't get done, and we remember President Clinton worked so hard all the way up until the end of his administration in January of 2001 to try to bring a deal to fruition. But at the end, Arafat just kept saying no, and it didn't happen.
Mhm. So that was at Camp David in 2000 when, was it with?
We had the
Ehud-
White River
was it
talks in
Ulmer
2000
at
in
that
Maryland.
point?
Correct. And then Camp David in January of 01.
Yeah, okay. And in that situation, what was on the table that was rejected?
The two-state solution, with Ehud Barak, then the Prime Minister of Israel, offering Arafat about, depending upon who you believe here, 97 to 98% of what Arafat wanted. And Arafat, consistent with the decades-long position of his predecessors, Ahmed Shukeri, the original founder of the PLO in 1964, and before him, the Mufti, his position was all or nothing, all or nothing. And even later in 2008, Prime Minister Ehud Olmert from the Likud offered Mahmoud Abbas 99%, including, and people don't realize this, including the internationalization of the old city of Jerusalem. That's what Olmert offered in 2008. Again, Israel keeping some areas around Jerusalem, giving the compensatory land and on the other periphery of the West Bank to make up for that. And unfortunately, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas said no. And that kind of left us where we were until we got to where we are today. Against that backdrop, I should also mention, of course, that in September of 2005, Israel withdrew unilaterally, completely 100% from Gaza, from the Gaza Strip, handed the keys over to Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. But unfortunately, a year and a half later, in June of 2007, Hamas overthrew the Palestinian Authority, took over the governance, the rule, the dictatorial rule in Gaza. And from June of 2007 until October 7, 2023, Gaza was occupied in that sense solely by Hamas.
Okay, so let's go back to the West Bank and what you described as areas A, B, and C.
Yeah.
A being, as I understand it, controlled by the Palestinians, B, a mix of Israel and the Palestinians, and C, mainly Israel. Is that correct?
Yeah, A would be the larger towns, Ramallah, Nablus, Hebron, Tulkarem, etc. B would be the more medium-sized towns. Both A and B, almost exclusively under Palestinian civilian control, civic authority, police, sanitation, governance, etc., with, of course, Israeli military reserving the right, as they've been doing in Jenin and Tulkarem recently, to come in from time to time and engage in military operations. But if you're an Israeli civilian and you go to the Kalandia checkpoint to enter Ramallah, there's a huge sign there in red that says Israeli nationals do not enter. You're not allowed into Area A. And so, when I hear a lot of the rhetoric about apartheid in the West Bank, I usually say, well, look, the situation today there, A, B, and C, is exactly what Arafat and Abu Mazen negotiated for in the Oslo Accords. Now, it's terribly unfortunate that we weren't able to meet that original aspiration of a permanent deal by the end of 1999 because we'd have a Palestinian state today. And maybe the Israelis living in what used to be Area C would become the settlers. Maybe they'd be Palestinian citizens, Jews, or maybe they'd be dual citizens of the state of Palestine and the state of Israel. It's really unfortunate. You can tell the way I'm talking, I'm a strong proponent of Palestinian statehood in the West Bank and Gaza. And I hope and pray that we get there when we get past this current war. And maybe we can talk about whether litigation or diplomacy is the right way for the Palestinians to get there. But I reject as a legal matter the notion that there's apartheid when one party agreed to the division of the area into A, B, and C. Both parties
Okay.
agreed.
Can we talk about the settlements too then?
Oh, sure.
And so the settlements continue, um, much against what the United States wants.
Yeah.
They wanted a halt to the settlements.
Yeah.
They legally allowed to build as many settlements as they want to bring in as many Israeli settlers as they want to. Do they have to be in certain areas?
Yeah.
There has been apparently a lot of settler activity during this period of war in Gaza, increased the building of settlements and appropriation of land. So can you just tell us exactly what they are allowed and not allowed
Yeah.
to do under these agreements?
Yeah. So the Oslo Accords are ambiguous. The Oslo Accords say that the settlements can stay put until such time as a permanent status, a permanent peace agreement is reached. So does that mean that the settlements that were there as of 1993 and 1995 were frozen? No more additional apartments, no more additional people could move in, no more somebody who wants to move out of a settlement to move to Tel Aviv can't sell their existing apartment to somebody from Tel Aviv who wants to move in. Does it mean that? Or does it mean that the settlements within their then boundaries were fixed, but there could be more building inside those existing boundaries? And that's something that the United States has opposed under both Democratic and Republican administrations, viewing additional building within settlements, or even worse, building new settlements that didn't exist as of the moment the Oslo Accords were signed. The United States' position has been for decades that that activity constitutes an obstacle to peace. The Palestinian position, the position of the vast majority of nations, is that that activity is not just an obstacle to peace, but it's illegal under international law. My answer is the Oslo Accords don't specifically say that it is illegal to build new apartments within existing settlement boundaries, or even to build more settlements in Area C, the area that the Palestinians agreed would remain under Israeli control during the interim years, pending a final status agreement. So unfortunately, again, the negotiators of the Oslo Accords left an enormous amount of ambiguity on the question of the legality of settlements and whether or not settlements could be expanded beyond their borders, or even new construction within existing settlements.
So they're
I,
not
for
allowed
one,
to
though,
build in
just want,
areas A or B, right?
no, there are no settlements in areas A and B, zero. And as I said, Israelis are forbidden. Civilian Israelis are forbidden from entering A and B. Now, look, if you're a Palestinian living in Area A, let's say you live in Ramallah, and you want to go visit your cousin in Nablus or in Hebron, you have to pass through Israeli checkpoints on the way. It is a humiliating experience. It's a degrading experience. If you're a Palestinian in Ramallah and you have a job in Jerusalem, you have to go through that Kalandia checkpoint, and it may take you hours. If you need to be at your job by 8 in the morning, you better get up at 3 a.m. This is no way for people to live. This is no way for people to live. It's humiliating and degrading. And the sooner we get to a final peace deal, the better. But unfortunately, the leadership right now, and I'm being a little bit political here, but so forgive me. I just came back from Israel a couple of weeks ago, so this is very raw for me. And I've been there many, many times in my life. I've never seen it worse than it is now. The leadership on both sides, the Netanyahu government and the government in Ramallah, the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas in Gaza, none of them are moving forward to end this conflict and to make peace. And it is absolutely vital that we move toward new leadership in Jerusalem, new leadership in Ramallah, and a post-war arrangement in Gaza that will facilitate the Palestinian Authority's return to control in Gaza, so we have a single unified future state of Palestine comprised of the West Bank and Gaza, with leaders who will negotiate with hopefully a new leadership in Jerusalem to make a deal.
The International Court of Justice is hearing testimony on this very issue. So they are hearing testimony on whether the occupation is illegal, and main argument that, as you mentioned, with these going through these checkpoints and not having a contiguous territory is violating the rights, the human rights of Palestinians for self-determination. What do you think is going to come out of this, if anything?
So there are actually three cases right now in the international courts that are very significant. One is the one you just mentioned. The UN General Assembly asked the International Court of Justice, based in The Hague in the Netherlands, for a so-called advisory opinion regarding the legality of Israel's presence in the West Bank, the settlements, Israel's presence in East Jerusalem. And word on the street in The Hague is that that ruling is going to come down probably before the end of July, early August at the latest. So it's imminent, this ruling. I expect it to be absolutely devastating for Israel, devastating. One of the questions the UN General Assembly is asking the court to opine on is what should be the consequences for Israel of the more than half-century occupation, etc. And who knows what the court is going to say. I mean, the court, the presiding judge is from Lebanon. As I look at the court, I think there may be one vote for Israel, maybe, out of the 15 judges. It's going to be a devastatingly bad ruling for Israel. Now, in my work, my academic work, what I try to do is to separate the Palestinian political case for statehood, which I think is strong and fair, from their legal case. They agreed in Oslo to pursue all the remaining issues through negotiation and diplomacy and statecraft. But before the ink was dry, they began litigating in the international courts. And so we have that one case where I expect a very bad ruling, and we can talk about the merit or lack of merit of that case. Second case pending is also at the International Court of Justice, South Africa, in December of last year, accusing Israel of genocide in Gaza. The court has issued 3 provisional rulings, kind of akin, for those of you lawyers, to injunctive relief in the American system. The court has issued 3 rulings in January and March and in May, not ruling in any way, shape, or form that Israel is or isn't committing genocide, but asking Israel or ordering Israel, purporting to order Israel, to avoid committing genocide by providing humanitarian aid, by not targeting civilians, by not entering Rafah. That was the May order. So that's the second case, the genocide case. And then the third case is at the International Criminal Court, also in The Hague, about a mile or so away from the Peace Palace, where the International Court of Justice is located. The prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, a British lawyer named Karim Khan, announced on May 20th, about 6 weeks ago, that he is seeking from the court the issuance of arrest warrants for the leaders of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, Ismail Haniyeh, who's in the 5-star hotel in Doha, for the war crimes and crimes against humanity that Hamas committed in the massacres and rapes and sexual violence of October 7th. And at the same time, the prosecutor is seeking the issuance of arrest warrants against the prime minister and the defense minister of the state of Israel for what he alleges are crimes against humanity and war crimes with respect to how Israel has prosecuted the war against Hamas in Gaza. And there's breaking news on this just today. Last month, the British government filed a pleading in the International Criminal Court, asserting that the court lacks jurisdiction to issue these arrest warrants as to the Israelis, because, again, pointing to the Oslo Accords in the 1995, the more detailed Oslo document that I mentioned, Article 17, Subpart 2, Subpart C, forgive me for citing the exact section, says right there that the Palestinians have no jurisdiction over Israeli citizens. And the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction is delegated by states or derived from delegations by states to the court. And so if the Palestinians agreed in Oslo, they have no jurisdiction over Israelis, how can they delegate that jurisdiction to the... So that's what the British government said. But we had an election last weekend and a change of government in the UK. And the new UK government, and this is now in the Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post, and it made it to a couple of European papers just this afternoon. The UK government is apparently going to withdraw that filing made by the Rishi Sunak government last month and say, never mind, we think that you ought to issue the arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant.
Did they
And
say they were going to withdraw or just look at it
they
again?
said officially they're going to look at it, but the newspaper leaks are now saying that the British government, the new government, is very likely to tell the court, never mind, we no longer oppose the issuance of arrest warrants. And so that's why Netanyahu, who's coming to Washington to address a joint session of Congress, is going to stop on the way to Washington from Tel Aviv in Budapest and in Prague, asking both those governments to make a filing with the ICC objecting to the court's jurisdiction over him and Gallant.
But why would the International Criminal Court have deference to the Oslo Peace Accord when it comes to jurisdiction?
Well, again, the court only derives its jurisdiction from countries who delegate that jurisdiction to the court. And there is a provision in the governing treaty for the International Criminal Court, known as the Rome Statute of 1998, that says, without a valid delegation of jurisdiction, you have no jurisdiction. There's another provision that says, in any event, even if you do have jurisdiction, you shouldn't exercise that jurisdiction if you're investigating somebody inside a country and their home country is also investigating them. That's the principle of complementarity. You don't step in if the host government is already investigating. Now, is the Israeli government investigating Netanyahu for Gaza? No. He's under indictment for fraud and bribery. He's going on trial. He's on trial, actually, now. His trial will resume in December. Kind of side comment, hard to contemplate that two of the most important democracies in the world, the United States and Israel, may be led next year by two convicted felons. I won't make more editorial comments about that. I hope that doesn't happen. But to go back to the point, it's clear, I mean, it is clear that the Oslo Accords deprive the Palestinian Authority of any jurisdiction over any Israeli citizen, and therefore, if they don't have jurisdiction over Netanyahu, how can they possibly delegate or transfer jurisdiction that they don't have to the ICC, the International Criminal Court? That's the legal argument that Britain has made.
What about the substance of the accusations? And I don't know if this is in your bailiwick as a legal scholar, but if something you can comment on since you were just there, they're accusing, and I'll just talk about the accusations against the Israeli leadership. They're accusing Israel of exacting collective punishment, of intentionally cutting off food, electricity, water, etc. at the start of the conflict, but bombing homes, schools, hospitals, out of proportion to the normal rules of war, if there are such things. So I'm just wondering, as a lawyer, what you make of these accusations and how do you assess them? It's hard to get information out of Gaza because Israel has restricted journalists from entering and operating independently. But I'm just wondering what you make of it from a legal perspective.
Yeah, so actually there were journalists in Gaza for the first several months of the war, harder for them to get in now. Israel took some journalists yesterday on a tour of Gaza, but of course that was under military guard.
Embed, yeah.
They're not allowed to operate. Let me kind of start the high level and then work my way down. Whether it's the prosecutor in the International Criminal Court seeking arrest warrants for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity, or whether it's the South Africans asking the International Court of Justice to declare that Israel is committing genocide, you know, as a legal matter, these claims are extraordinarily weak, I must say. Extraordinarily weak, regardless of what I've just said about Netanyahu. And I hope that we have new leadership in Jerusalem soon. These legal arguments are incredibly weak. Let's start with genocide. The Genocide Convention of 1948 requires proof of specific intent to destroy a people in whole or in part. to destroy a people in whole or in part. And any of us who have been to Auschwitz, Birkenau, to Majdanek, to Dachau, and seen the German industrialization of mass murder in World War II, transporting Jews, collecting them, arresting them, transporting them hundreds of miles by rail to camps, facilities that were built for the purpose of gassing them and murdering them or working them to death and then incinerating their remains. That's genocide. That's genocide. What is happening in Gaza, I would argue, is a lawful war of Israel by Israel of
Let me know how
self-defense.
many seats we need and I will be happy to email it.
Oh, Janice.
That's okay, Janice. It's a lawful war of self-defense.
But the
Is it-
ICC is not accusing them of genocide, right? They're
Well, no, but the South Africans are. Let me come to the
Okay.
ICC claims. The prosecutor at the ICC is saying, okay, maybe you have a right of self-defense, and these are the specific statements that the prosecutor made in his press conference when he announced on May 20th that he was seeking the arrest warrants. Israelis are deliberately starving people to death. Israelis are using food as a weapon of war. The Israelis are deliberately and indiscriminately targeting civilians without regard to whether there are Hamas terrorists in the areas where Israel is bombing or fighting. There is no evidence that Israel is deliberately targeting or indiscriminately targeting civilians. Are civilians dying? Of course they are. Is it horrible? Yes, it's horrible. I have friends. I mentioned my work for UCLA. I have friends in Gaza. Some of them have luckily been able to escape to Cairo, who have lost large numbers of relatives. It breaks my heart. It's terrible. But are the Israelis, is the IDF deliberately killing civilians when you have an enemy, Hamas, who proudly declares that it is part of their doctrine, part of their fighting doctrine, to embed themselves among the civilian population, hoping to draw Israeli fire into that population so that population will die. That is what Hamas's tactics and their strategy is all about. They've tried that multiple times already in the prior rounds of fighting between the Israelis and Hamas in 2009, in 2014, 2021, each time Hamas realizing, hey, when we provoke the Israelis into killing our civilians, we always win in the public arena. The Israelis are terrible at PR, we're great at PR. And the more of this we do, the better it will be for us. And it doesn't matter if we agreed to a ceasefire in 2009 and a ceasefire in 2014 and a ceasefire in 2021, or maybe a ceasefire in 2024, because we'll violate it. We'll start shooting again when we're ready, when we are able to rearm. That's the Israeli concern. And so there's very little evidence in support of the prosecutor's allegations. Let me just talk about food and starvation for a minute. There's a UN agency that is responsible for keeping track of food supplies in Gaza. In March, they said that 1 million Gazans were at risk of starvation. They issued an update to that report a couple of weeks ago saying, we were wrong. Actually, there's a lot of food in Gaza. Actually, nobody is starving, but we need to keep monitoring this because there's still a grave risk if the situation changes. So when it comes to seeking arrest warrants, as a former prosecutor, I'm used to the system here in the United States of America where you need to present an affidavit under oath, under penalty of perjury, signed by an FBI agent to a federal judge, reciting facts that establish probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed. What the ICC prosecutor has shown, at least so far, falls well below that threshold of probable cause. And it's my position as a legal matter that issuing these arrest warrants is wrong. As a political matter, it's my position that issuing the arrest warrants will do nothing, zero, to bring the parties any closer to peace. We need diplomacy. We need statecraft. We need negotiation, not litigation.
Well, I guess to look at the Oslo Peace Accords, if you look at that as a multi-year effort at the highest levels of diplomacy and statecraft, and bringing together various sides who had never even thought that they would shake hands, actually having a fairly warm friendship. When you talk about Rabin and Arafat, and that didn't work. I guess you could be a little pessimistic when it comes to the using diplomacy rather than litigation if you wanted your own independent state. So
Yeah.
do you think Oslo is pretty much dead, and does there need to be a new attempt and a new negotiation, maybe name it something else? I don't know,
Yeah.
but restart? And is that, I know we're in the middle of a war, and
Yeah.
no side is really interested in two states anymore, but is that at all remotely a possibility?
Yeah. So 3 weeks ago in Jerusalem, if any of you are familiar with the Inbal Hotel, a rather orthodox hotel, I had coffee with a prominent Palestinian businessman from Jericho and a prominent Israeli former ambassador to a foreign country. And the two of them vehemently agreed with each other after they hugged and kissed each other when we all came together. They've been friends for years. They vehemently agreed not on just the need for new leadership, but they agreed that the war, the silver lining in this war, is that it really can create an opportunity to bring moderates on both sides, like these two people, together. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm not saying it's going to happen overnight, but it is much more likely to happen through diplomacy than through litigation. Far more likely to happen. Litigation will lead us nowhere. The only choice for people on the Israeli side and people on the Palestinian side who care about the future of their children is to sit down together and work through these issues. Palestinian statehood now must be identified up front as the goal. Up front as the goal. And then we need to work backward from there to where we are now and figure out how to get there in a way that will give the Israelis confidence that this is not just another agreement that will be breached down the road, but it's an agreement that can be enforced, an agreement that will have the backing of the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Americans and the Europeans, and hopefully even, maybe I'm too hopeful, China and Russia, certainly not Iran, but international guarantees for Israel's safety and security, a Palestinian state that is disarmed, that doesn't have an army. We have examples like that. Costa Rica, for example, doesn't have an army. Palestine doesn't need an army. Israel is no threat to Palestine. At least I can say that with some confidence. And a robust economic relationship between both sides, maybe not right away, but eventually. Both sides need each other. And Palestinian moderates and Palestinian entrepreneurs understand that, and they want that. They want warm ties between the two countries. Maybe we need, Madeleine, some kind of a reconciliation process like we had after the end of the white rule in South Africa. I'm not in any way comparing Israel to South Africa, don't get me wrong. But when I talked about the humiliation and the degradation of the occupation, maybe we need some kind of a process to air that. I also want to make one point that I should have made earlier about Oslo, because I've been blaming the Palestinian side largely for not moving forward with what they promised in Oslo, litigating instead of negotiating and so forth. I need to cast blame on the Israeli side too, for particularly after the assassination of Rabin. Israelis really slow-rolled the Oslo process. In particular, the interim agreement, the 1995 deal, requires Israel slowly over time to withdraw slowly from portions of Area C, and they haven't done that. And that is a violation of Oslo as well. So there is plenty of blame to go around on both sides, and I want to just be very clear about that.
Okay, so I'll get to some of the questions now, because there is a question here that feeds into what you just said. Carol says, is it even possible as a practical matter to have a Palestinian state made up of two pieces of land, West Bank and Gaza, that are not contiguous? And then also, when you look at the West Bank, areas A and B are not contiguous either. How do you create a physical Palestinian state?
Well, the West Bank is going to be much easier itself because there won't be an Area C anymore. The idea is that, and this was the original conception of the Oslo Accords, not statehood, but that over time Israel would withdraw eventually from all of Area C. That didn't mean a state of Palestine. It might have meant a province or maybe Palestine would revert to Jordan. We don't know. We don't know what Oslo contemplated at the end state. But what it did contemplate, and what certainly would have to happen, would be a full Israeli withdrawal from Area C, except we do have this swath of settlements I mentioned earlier that ring Jerusalem. It'll be very hard to uproot Israel from that small, call it 1 to 2% of the West Bank, and there will have to be some compensatory land swaps. And that was more or less agreed to between Arafat and Rabin and Clinton in 2000, 2001. It was more or less agreed to between Olmert and Abu Mazen in 2008. So that's not going to be that difficult if we have the political will to get it done. The hard part will be uprooting the settlers. That's why I suggest maybe let's think creatively. Maybe the settlers can become Palestinian citizens. The settlements will be under Palestinian rule and Palestinian jurisdiction. You never know. I mean, stranger things have happened.
When you think of a lot of these settlers, they're very right wing.
Oh, sure. I mean, a lot of them are terribly right wing, but there's also a lot of young Israelis who move to the settlements. It's like people who live in Los Angeles buying a house, in Palmdale or Lancaster and commuting 2 hours a day because they can get a nice family home in a cheaper part of LA County. Same story in Israel. Housing is horrifically expensive in Tel Aviv, and young families are moving away from Tel Aviv, but commuting to work in order to find a house or an apartment that is of an acceptable size. The other thing I would say about the West Bank and Gaza, there have been lots and lots of proposals for how to create some kind of a land bridge, a causeway, a tunnel, a private road, whatever it might be. This is, again, achievable. What we don't want to have happen, neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians, at least in the long run, is we don't want to have a situation like East and West Pakistan that went their separate ways in 1970, East Pakistan becoming Bangladesh. And so there are some people advocating the 3-state solution: Israel, West Bank, Gaza, all separate states. The Palestinians reject that out of hand. The Israelis agreed in the Oslo Accords, and now their hands are tied because the Israelis agreed that the West Bank and Gaza were a single, non-divisible entity to be eventually ruled by the Palestinian Authority.
Who are the responsible voices and parties, if any, on both sides, who might be able to create this future that you imagine? That is one of peace, one of sovereignty, one of respect of both peoples, 2 states, 3 states, whatever states. Who can both sides turn to at this moment?
The Israelis, their last prime minister for a year or so before Netanyahu came back to power was Yair Lapid, who spoke at the UN General Assembly opening session in September of 1992 and said publicly, the first time any Israeli prime minister has ever said this, Rabin never said this, Barak never said this. He said publicly at the UN, I support the 2-state solution. That was groundbreaking. Will Lapid be prime minister again? Probably not. He's very, very low in the polling in Israel. Remember, you vote for a party, not for a person, but he polls very poorly nowadays. There is talk about Naftali Bennett from the Likud, perhaps replacing Netanyahu down the road. Bennett, like Ehud Olmert, a Likud hard right mayor of Jerusalem, who substantially moderated his position when he became prime minister. Maybe Bennett would become more moderate if given the chance to serve as prime minister for a longer period of time. On the Palestinian side, the young entrepreneurial class, there are plenty of moderates, and I can name them, although I know we're being recorded and I don't want to get anybody in trouble, but there are plenty, I assure you, of moderate Palestinians in the political realm, in the legal realm, in the business realm, who have a vision for the future that is not shared, unfortunately, by President Abu Mazen Mahmoud Abbas, who is currently in the 21st year of the 4-year term to which he was elected. We need new leadership. And there are many, many people of goodwill in Palestine who want a future that is better for their children than the future that was bequeathed to them by Arafat and Abu Mazen.
Well, I guess the bigger question is, what do you do about Hamas?
Yeah.
Because as many people are now saying, and maybe said at the outset, it'll be impossible to extinguish Hamas completely. So what do you do about this organization that is bent on Israel's destruction and doesn't want to have peace with Israel at this point?
Yeah. So even the spokesperson for the Israeli military recently said publicly, to the consternation of the government, that the army can't defeat Hamas, the ideology, the hate. But remember, the Nazis were defeated in World War II. Are there still Nazis in Germany? Yes. Just go to an AfD rally in Dresden or in Leipzig and you will see what I'm talking about. Hamas will be there for sure. Right now, they're wildly popular. If there were an election in the West Bank, Hamas, according to the latest polls I've seen, would win about 77% of the vote. But I think over the long term, that popularity will wane. There are voices of dissent, a few brave souls in Gaza willing to speak out against Hamas. They'll be there. Maybe there will even be some role for them in the government. You know, it was inconceivable to the British government that the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, would ever have anything to do with the governance of Northern Ireland. And yet, when Gerry Adams split off the political wing of the IRA from the military wing of the IRA, that eventually paved the way for the Good Friday Agreement that George Mitchell and the Clinton administration negotiated. And so, look, I prefer to remain optimistic about this, despite the horror of October 7th, despite the tragedy of civilian casualties in the war. And by the way, I want to say one more word about the civilian casualties in Gaza. It is horrific. It's horrible. I don't believe there's evidence that Israel is deliberately targeting civilians, deliberately starving civilians. And I would just say that, and my friend David Makovsky, who works with Aaron David Miller, has said this before. If you look at the coalition, the United States military's effort in Mosul, Iraq, to retake Mosul from ISIS a few years ago, the civilian to ISIS casualty ratio was 9 civilians for every 1 ISIS fighter, 9-1. In Gaza, even if you believe the numbers coming from Hamas, 36, 37,000, and I would question the credibility of any numbers coming from Hamas. Remember, they said 500 people died at the Al-Ahli hospital from an Israeli bomb. It was a Palestinian errant rocket. It killed 50 people, not 500. Even if you believe Hamas, 36, 37,000, half of those, according to the Israeli military, are Hamas terrorists, equating to a 1-to-1 ratio, not a 9-to-1 ratio like the United States inflicted in Mosul. When we did it, it was called collateral damage. Israel does it, it's called genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity. Legally, not a sustainable argument.
Right. But it is creating a situation, many people have said, that could provide a fertile ground for the future Sinwars of the world to rise up.
For sure.
You know, the place is destroyed. People have lost everything. And if they haven't been killed, they've lost family members or friends, as you've mentioned.
Yeah.
Or they're traumatized, or they're physically, affected, mentally affected, what have you. They've lost everything. So I guess it would be building a society up from nothing, from ashes. I know you want to be optimistic, and we're sort of at the end of the program, but do you think that we're going to see that in our lifetime, that we're going to see a prosperous two-state solution in
I hope
Israel?
during mine, certainly during yours, you're much younger than me. I would just say this, that I have a journalist friend in London who has sources in Gaza who have been secretly sending him videos. Gaza is not destroyed. There's a lot of destruction, but there are enormous parts of Gaza, in Khan Yunis, in Gaza City, in Rafah, that have not been touched at all. And with enough money from the donor countries, Gaza will be rebuilt in far less time than people think. And the worst thing that could happen would be for Israel to reoccupy Gaza, because that will become a breeding ground for resistance, new terrorists, and so forth. The the Palestinians have to take control of their own destiny under leadership committed, maybe not to warm, fuzzy, friendly relations with Israel, but at least an end of conflict arrangement with Israel, to let the new generation, the young people, grow up with dignity, with security, economically and physically, to pursue their lives. I've studied this conflict for decades. I've spent enormous amounts of time in the archives in the UK, in Israel, etc. I've worked for the last decade with people from the region. I have no reason to be optimistic, but I am. Because I'm inspired, Madeleine, by Palestinians who want peace, by Israelis who want peace, and by other Arabs from around the region who want the same thing.
Okay, that's a great note to end on. Steve, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a great conversation, and I appreciate your time and insight.
Thank you, and thank you very much to Jews United for Democracy and Justice. We have about 3,000 people listening. If each of us can get 10 people to vote in November, imagine the difference we can make. Thank you all very much for having me.
All right, it's our pleasure. And stay tuned. Next week, Pat Morrison will be in conversation with Richard Haas. So come back again for that fascinating discussion for sure. And thank you for joining us tonight. Have a great evening.